Hello everybody, my name is Chase Miller and this is my presentation on the First Crusade. So what was the First Crusade? To put it simply, the First Crusade was the first of many war expeditions where mainly Western Christians set out to reclaim Holy Land from Muslim control. The First Crusade was declared in the year 1095 by Pope Urban II, but didn't start really until the next year. Medieval Europe at the time around the First Crusade was not as put together as some other civilizations and regions. It was filled with warfare between local lords and fighting amongst each other. Europe did have kingdoms which would be described as following the feudal system, but these kingdoms didn't hold much power. There was no real central power, and Europe as a whole was still more or less unorganized, but at this point in time it was still significantly powerful and was riding a wave of population growth and economic revival. It's also important to note that at this time in Europe, the church held lots of influence and power over the people, and the Pope could be described as a politician and influencer who held legitimate power. Jerusalem. Jerusalem is one of the oldest cities in the world and is claimed to be Holy Land by all three of the Abrahamic religions, which makes it a sought-after city and is still in political turmoil even today. Jerusalem was the main target of the First Crusade, and it is the place where Jesus was crucified, buried, and resurrected. At the time of the First Crusade, Muslims had been ruling Jerusalem for the past 450 years after they took control of it amidst their conquest. Jerusalem was important to the Muslims because it is home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam and is associated with Prophet Muhammad's night journey ascension. Jerusalem has an extensive and brutal history with lots of changes in who controls it, and most of the time the exchange is very violent. But the Muslim takeover is said by most accounts to have been a bloodless takeover, and that the Muslims never really attacked the city. They just continued onward with their conquest and took control of the surrounding land and then waited for the Persians inside Jerusalem to surrender. Persians who were ruling the city had actually just taken the city from Christians only 23 years earlier, in which they killed 90,000 Christians and were said to be aided by the Jews within the city. Christianity and Islam has had quite the history, and the conflict started long before the First Crusade. The early Muslim conquest was initiated by Muhammad himself, who is the prophet of Islam, and saw the establishment of the first Islamic state, Medina, from which Muslim armies expanded rapidly. And when looking at statistics, their spread was incredibly fast and impressive, even when compared to other great conquests in history, such as the works of Alexander the Great. The early Muslim conquest was very successful and saw the takeover of many lands and kingdoms, the most important for this presentation being the conquest of Syria from the years 634 to 641, which held the takeover of Jerusalem. There were many conquests, but two other ones worth mentioning are the conquest of Egypt from the years 639 to 642, which, as stated in the name, was the conquest of Egypt, and the conquest of Hispania and Septimania, I butchered that, from 711 to the year 721, which saw the takeover of most of present-day Spain. It is safe to say most of the Muslim conquest was done unto Christians and Christian lands, so it's obvious there was tension and existing differences between Christians and Muslims before the First Crusade. In fact, they had been butting heads violently since the very establishment of Islam. The Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, was the continuation of the Roman Empire and built around the capital of Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire was a Christian empire, at least after Constantine legalized Christianity in the year 313, and Theodosius made it the state religion in the year 380. The empire was its strongest and greatest while under the rule of Justinian, where its territory expanded to Italy, Egypt, and Syria, but a plague arrived during Justinian's reign that reportedly killed 1/5 of Constantinople, which is crazy, And that, along with a long war with Persia, put a strain on the empire's power, and in the years of the 630s and the 640s, the Muslim conquest defeated the Byzantine armies in Egypt and Syria, which resulted in permanent loss of those regions. Alexius Komnenos, hopefully I'm saying that right, was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire between the years 1081 until his death in 1118. Alexius is known for leading a rebellion and taking the throne. He's also credited with stopping the Byzantine decline and began reclaiming land as he recovered the military and economic power of the Byzantine Empire. Alexius dealt with many battles and invaders during his reign, and it was his fight against the Seljuk Turks that forced him to call to Europe for aid in the fight. This was not the first time Alexius had received help from Europe. He also received help in his fight against the Normans from Holy Roman Empire Henry IV in Germany. Alexius wanted assistance from the west to fight the Turks. Allegedly, he wanted manpower in which he could command. So he made a formal appeal to Pope Urban II at the Council of Piacenza, and then at the following Council of Clermont, Pope Urban formally called for the First Crusade. There were thousands of crusaders and many different reasons between them for going on the crusade. Most went in blind faith and to fight for the honor of God. Some went for riches, but they all went because it was the will of Pope Urban II. So why did Pope Urban want the First Crusade? Pope Urban was faced with a call for help by Alexius in the year 1095. Alexius wanted help fighting the Turks, and as we know already, this wasn't his first time asking Europe for help, but coming directly to the Pope is a drastic step up, especially as Alexius was Eastern Christian, or as I guess we'd say today, or maybe even could label them as Orthodox, while Pope Urban was obviously Western Christian, or you could say Catholic. And those two did have their differences even at that time, and definitely today. Alexius supposedly was hoping for an elite force that he himself would command, but instead Pope Urban ordered for the crusade. Pope Urban II took Alexius' plea as a way to gain more influence and control as the Pope. He wanted more power, and the crusade was the perfect way to achieve that and put the church at the center of the political stage, while taking authority of Europe's knightly class and reducing the amount of infighting in Europe. In the year 1095, in Clermont, France, on November 27, Pope Urban II gave one of the most important speeches in history. He gave his speech in a field so it could be heard by all. The city of Clermont is next to a range of dormant volcanoes, so imagine the setting of the speech. Listening to the Pope talk with volcanoes off in the distance, acting as a symbol of his power. Many faithful gathered there to hear the Pope, and he told them this: "Dearest brethren, I, Urban, Supreme Pontiff, and by the permissions of God, Prelate of the whole world, have come in this time of urgent necessity to you, the servants of God in these regions, as a messenger for divine admonition." The Pope knew the power he held, and knew he would need to convince the people to fight. He said this: "A foreign people and a people rejected by God had invaded lands belonging to Christians, destroying them and plundering the local population. Many had been brutally murdered, others had been taken prisoner and carried off into captivity." The Pope described graphic scenes of what was being done by the Muslim Turks. They throw down altars after soiling them with their own filth, circumcise Christians, and pour the resulting blood either on the altars or in the baptismal vessels. When they feel like inflicting a truly painful death on some, they pierce their navels, pull out the end of their intestines, tie them to a pole, and whip them around until all their bowels are pulled out. They fall lifeless to the ground. They shoot arrows at others tied to stakes. Others again they attack, having stretched out their necks, unsheathing their sword to see if they can manage to hack off their heads with one blow. And what can I say about the appalling treatment of women? Which is better to pass over in silence than to spell out in detail? Urban then slightly shifted gears. Once he had gotten his message of the horrors across, he then said this: "Not I, but God, exhorts you as heralds of Christ to repeatedly urge men of all ranks whatsoever, knights as well as foot soldiers, rich and poor, to hasten to exterminate this vile race from our lands and to aid the Christian inhabitants in time." He had undoubtedly called the crowd to arms, as they responded by crying out, "Deus Vult, Deus Vult, Deus Vult," which means, "God wills it, God wills it, God wills it." And then less than 4 years later, Western Christian knights were standing outside Jerusalem. When looking at who participated in the First Crusade, it's important to understand that this was not just one group. The estimated numbers of crusaders was 100,000 to 150,000, and were made up of a wide variety of people from different social classes, each with their own motivations and expectations. It's said there were roughly 7,000 knights and 35 to 50,000 foot soldiers, along with many priests, peasants, and many non-combatants. It was very common for people's wives or servants or entire households to follow them on the crusade. Firstly, one of the most important groups involved were the knights. Knights were trained soldiers, and they made up the military backbone of the crusade. Many knights joined because they believed it was their religious duty to fight for Christianity. After Pope Urban II called for the crusade, knights were told that participating would grant them forgiveness of sins. For many of them, this was a powerful motivation. However, religion was not the only reason knights joined. Some were also hoping to gain land, wealth, or status in the East, especially since opportunities in Europe were limited for younger sons who did not inherit land. Another key group were the nobles. These were powerful landowners and leaders who often organized and funded crusading armies. Nobles played a major role in planning and leading the expeditions. Many of them saw the crusade as both a religious mission and a political opportunity. By going on crusade, they could expand their influence, gain new territories, and increase their prestige. Some nobles also had personal reasons, such as loyalty to the church or a desire to prove themselves as strong leaders. In addition to knights and nobles, a large number of peasants also took part in the crusade. Peasants were the lowest class in medieval society, and their lives were often very difficult. Many peasants joined the crusade because they were inspired by religious promises, especially the idea that they could earn salvation. Others saw it as a chance to escape poverty, famine, or harsh living conditions in Europe. Unlike knights and nobles, peasants were usually not trained for battle and were poorly equipped, which made their journey much more dangerous. This leads to a specific group known as the People's Crusade. This was made up mostly of peasants and lower class individuals who set out for the Holy Land before the main armies were fully organized. The People's Crusade was not well planned or led, and as a result, it faced serious problems. Many participants lacked supplies, training, and leadership. Along the way, they struggled with hunger, disease, and attacks. Most of this group never even made it to their destination and were defeated before reaching Jerusalem. On the other side of the First Crusade were the Muslim defenders. The Muslims were not a unified nation or army, and there were rivalries and history between the groups and leaders, but there was unification and coordination to defend from the Crusaders. Before the Crusaders arrived, control of the region, including Jerusalem, had shifted between different Muslim powers. The main group was the Seljuk Turks, or the main group who we will be focusing on and talking about a lot, who had expanded into the region and controlled much of the inland territory. At the same time, the Fatimid Caliphate, based in Egypt, controlled parts of the southern Palestine, including Jerusalem at certain points. Because these groups were often rivals, there was not always cooperation between them. During the Crusades, several key Muslim leaders played important roles in defending territory. For example, rulers like Ridwan of Aleppo and Dukuk of Damascus controlled important cities in Syria. However, they were often competing with each other, which weakened their ability to unite against the Crusader forces. The Muslims would hold cities and ground for as long as they could, but the Crusaders continued to carve through the east. The beginning. The Crusade was declared in the year 1095, but didn't really start until the year 1096. Once word had spread and people had prepared, before the Crusaders had even left Europe, there was a rise in attacks of non-Christians, specifically Jews. Groups of Christians, like the People's Crusade, raided and killed Jewish homes and hotspots as acts of spiritual warfare and a way to gain money for the expedition, and one of the most common known of the Jewish persecutions is the Rhineland Massacre, where those from the People's Crusades killed 2,000 Jews in multiple different cities in lashes of anger, as they were mostly peasants who were in debt to Jews in order to finance their crusading gear. Armies from Germany, France, Italy, and Christians from all over Europe began their journey towards Muslim territory, which was over 2,100 miles in some of their cases, sometimes more, sometimes less, and involved lots of dangerous terrain. The most famous path traveled is known as the Templar Trail, in which Godfrey of Bouillon and Duke of Lower Lorraine traveled with their troops on their way to take Jerusalem. The Crusaders would leave trails of theft, but also economic growth, as they bought supplies from merchants on their journey. Okay, hardships. The journey to Jerusalem was not an easy one, and it was plagued with thieves, harsh terrain, and Muslim attacks. The largest group of crusaders was the People's Crusade, led mainly by Peter the Hermit, a priest, and made up of mostly peasants. They were the first to venture out towards Jerusalem after leaving before the planned time of the 15th of August that the main four armies left on, as they were supposed to. The People's Crusade was also the worst equipped, made up of priests and peasants who were not armed. They were not armed. They did not have weapons, or they were slightly armed. And a few trained soldiers, with many people leaving or dying before they even faced real Muslim resistance. The People's Crusade was ultimately a failure of a force. Once they reached Anatolia, their leadership and force split, with the Germans leaving, mostly the Germans. The People's Crusade split kind of ethnically, and a group of mostly Germans left the main force, and Peter the Hermit was going back to Constantinople to negotiate supplies, but he never returned to the group. The rest of the leaders wanted to wait for Peter, but with spies inside the Crusaders group feeding false information and Joffrey Burrell taking command, he thought it cowardly to sit and wait, so they ventured out towards the Turks. The force made it only 3 miles from their camp when they were ambushed in Wooden Valley, where the force of 20 to 60,000 Crusaders, most likely closer to the 20,000, but some have said up to 60,000, these Crusaders fell into chaos and were chased back to the camp by the force of an estimated 5,000 Turks. So 5,000 Turks chased maybe 20 to 30 to even 60,000 Crusaders out of this valley back to their camp. This is known as the Battle of Civitate, and resulted in the People's Crusade being slaughtered, along with their women and children and other non-combatants. Allegedly around 3,000, were able to hold out an abandoned castle until the Byzantines could rescue them, and they would later join the better forces of the Crusade. Reportedly, only nuns, young girls, and young boys who could be made slaves were taken alive during the battle, meaning that almost no one was spared by the Turks. The German break-off from the People's Crusades fell at the Siege of Zaragoza, where the 6,000 German Crusaders who had split from the main force were led by Reynold of Blois. They took over the fort of Zaragoza from the Turks, but only held it for a few days before more Turks arrived and took back the city. This group also was infiltrated by spies who spread the information that the Crusaders' main force was on its way and that the force was safe. The much better equipped four main armies reached Constantinople after the People's Crusade was already lost, and they had run into multiple fights and battles before reaching Constantinople. Excuse me, sorry. Which, by the time they did, they had little supplies and little food. Crusaders reach Constantinople. The Crusaders reached Constantinople and were not met with a warm welcome. Alexius had not been hoping for this sort of army, and most groups arrived there with little food and supplies. So there was lots of pillaging, especially among the People's Crusade. The main four Crusader armies that left around the 15th of August of the year 1096, and they had reached Constantinople between November 1096 and April 1097. Hugh of Vermandois arrived first, followed by Godfrey, Raymond, and Bohemond. Alexius was understandably suspicious after his experience with the People's Crusade, and also because the knights included his old Norman enemy, Bohemond, who had invaded Byzantine territory on numerous occasions with his father, and may have even attempted to organize an attack on Constantinople while encamped outside the city. This time, Alexius was more prepared for the Crusaders, and there were fewer incidents of violence along the way. Nicaea had been captured from the Byzantines by the Turks in 1081. The People's Crusade had pillaged the surrounding area before being wiped out, so the town thought the new Crusaders would be similar. This new wave of Crusaders consisted of Godfrey of Bouillon, who was the first to arrive at Nicaea, with Bohemond of Taranto maybe, Bohemond's nephew Tancred, Raymond IV of Toulouse, and Robert II of Flanders following him, along with Peter the Hermit and some of the survivors of the People's Crusade, and a small Byzantine force. The Crusaders arrived on May 6 with little food, but there were arrangements for more food and Crusaders to arrive soon. The siege started on May 14 with different groups of Crusaders attacking different sections of walls. On the 16th, the Turks took the offensive, but lost 200 men. They then sent messages to Kilij Arslan, who was the leader of the city, but was not there since he assumed the Crusaders would not be trouble. Kilij Arslan sent out an advance team, which was defeated by Raymond and Robert, and then the rest of his force was beaten in a deadly battle on May 20. The rest of the Crusaders arrived weeks after, and the Turks of Nicaea now stood no chance. Alexius decided not to fight directly with the Crusaders, but to instead take a section of the wall and take naval superiority to stop Turkish vessels. Alexius sent his boats under the command of Manuel Batamites, with the plan to negotiate the surrender of Nicaea without the Crusaders' knowledge. The Turks accepted this and secretly surrendered the city of Nicaea to the Byzantines in a way that it seemed that the Byzantines won it through force. The Crusaders eventually learned of this and were furious. Alexius gave the Crusaders horses and money, but this was not enough for them. But nevertheless, the city of Nicaea was now back in the control of the Byzantines. Okay, the Siege of Antioch. This slide's going to be a little bit longer. The Siege of Antioch is very interesting, so I didn't want to skip any details. Very good information on this. So, as the Crusaders continued deeper into Muslim lands closer to Jerusalem, they found themselves laying a devastating siege onto the city of Antioch, where thousands died from not just battle, but starvation and illness as well. The Crusaders will have to take Antioch and then hold it against the Turks' own siege on the city in attempts to take it back. Antioch was a massive city, and before the siege could start, the Crusaders had to take control of other essential sites. The town of Arta, the Iron Bridge across the Orontes, and the harbor of Saint Simon, or Simeon, excuse me. The town of Arta had actually recently been taken over by the Armenian population, which welcomed Robert of Flanders and his army into the city and even gave them supplies. A Muslim Turkish force was sent to take back the city, but immediately retreated at the arrival of the Crusaders. The Iron Bridge was taken when a Catholic bishop named Adhemer of Lepoy led a charge across the bridge, which opened the way for the advancing Crusaders to reach the gates. But the bridge was close enough to receive fire from the Antioch garrison attacks, so to say they fully had control of it is kind of up in the air a little bit, you might say. And the harbor of Saint Simeon was not necessarily controlled since it was so close to Antioch, but 13 Genoese ships were able to meet up with the Crusaders, although they reported suffering heavy casualties while en route from Saint Simeon to Antioch. The Crusaders at first could scavenge the area near the gates and walls, since the Turks didn't dare come out, but soon they had to go further to look for food, which left the Crusaders vulnerable to attacks from the Turks, which they did often. The Turks started attacking a lot more. The Crusaders had now been sieging for 2 months, and winter had driven them to starvation. Bohemond and Robert of Flanders took 20,000 men to go find food and plunder, while leaving Raymond and his men there alone. Antioch's leader, Yagi-Cian, and the Turks figured this out, so they launched an attack against Raymond on the night of December 29, crossing the river to attack him in darkness. Raymond was caught by surprise, but was able to fight Yagi-Cian off, and fought him all the way back to the city gates, where they were actually able to hold open the city gates. But, in a strange twist of fortune, it's said that a horse lost its rider, and in the chaos of that scene, the Crusaders panicked and retreated back to their camp. So, kind of a lost opportunity there. But Bohemond and Robert of Flanders were intercepted while looking for food by Tutak of Damascus, who was en route to relieve Antioch, but caught word of the plundering and foraging Crusaders and decided to attack. The two armies met at the village of Albara and fought a deadly battle in which both sides took on heavy casualties. Tutak and his men retreated to Hama, while the Crusaders were forced to stop foraging and returned to Antioch. Throughout the rest of the winter and spring, food continued to be a problem for the Crusaders, and it's said that 1/5 of the Crusaders had died of hunger, although numbers vary from different accounts. Now, in May, the Crusaders caught word of a bigger Muslim Turkish army approaching Antioch from Mosul under the command of Kerboha. With the plan of relieving Antioch, the Crusaders now knew they had to take the city before their arrival. Bohemond had somehow secretly made a contact with a guard of the city who was in control of the Tower of the Two Sisters. The guard was named Feroz. Feroz said that he would let Bohemond into the city in exchange for money and a title. Bohemond himself wasn't sure why exactly Feroz would do this, but despite the opinion of Raymond and the mysterious motives of Feroz, Bohemond went with the plan. Some Crusaders were deserting, and on that same day of them deserting, Feroz instructed Bohemond to have a fake march south over the mountains, and then double back at night to scale the wall. So, a small group of Crusaders, including Bohemond, scaled the wall at the Tower of the Two Sisters, where Feroz held watch, and then they let in a bigger group of crusaders into the gates, who had been hiding, and the city fell into chaos and fighting. Bohemond pushed forwards towards the citadel of the city, while other remaining crusaders defeated the rest of the Turks' defense. And the poorer crusaders are said to have pillaged and seized everything they could find, with just basically no regards of their duty. Armenians and Greeks also joined in on the fighting, fighting the Turks. They were along the side of the crusaders. And the leader of the city, Yagisyan, was caught fleeing the city by Armenian and Syrian Christians some distance outside the city, and his severed head was brought to Bohemond. So the city was now held by the Crusaders, except for the citadel, which was still held by Yagisyan's son, Shemus Adullah. The city was now short on food, and Kerboha's army was still on its way. Kerboha arrived on June 5. He tried and failed to storm the city on June 7, and by June 9, he had established his own siege around the city. More crusaders had deserted before Kerboha arrived, and they joined Stephen in Tarsus. Stephen had seen Kerboha's army encamped near Antioch and assumed all hope was lost, and the word of the deserters confirmed this. So on the way back to Constantinople, Stephen and other deserters like William the Carpenter met Alexios, who was actually heading towards Antioch to assist the Crusaders, and he did not know that they had taken the city, but were now actually under siege themselves. Stephen convinced him that the rest of the Crusaders were as good as dead, and Alexios heard from his reconnaissance there was another Turkish army nearby. So Alexios returned to Constantinople, assuming Antioch was going to fall. While within Antioch, Bohemond and the Crusaders looked for the Holy Lance, which was supposed to be within the city, according to a priest named Peter Bartholomew. On June 15, they were digging in the Cathedral of St. Peter, and Peter Bartholomew, the priest, pulled from the dirt a spear joint. Raymond took this as a divine sign that they would survive, and thus prepared for a final fight rather than surrender. Peter then reported another vision in which St. Andrew instructed the Crusader army to fast for 5 days, although they were already starving. And after doing that, they would be victorious. And then on June 28, the Crusaders charged from the city gates outwards, with Raymond of Aguiliers carrying the Holy Lance, charging towards the Turks. Kerboha hesitated against his general's pleadings to attack the Crusaders all at once, rather than one division at a time, but he underestimated their size. He pretended to retreat to draw the Crusaders to rougher terrain, while his archers continuously pelted the Crusaders with arrows. Kerboha then dispatched men to the Crusaders' left wing, but Bohemond quickly formed a 7th division and beat them back. The Crusaders were taking heavy casualties, and Kerboha set fire to the grass between his position and the Crusaders, but this did not deter the Crusaders. They apparently had visions of 3 saints riding along with them: St. George, St. Macaris, and St. Demetrius. The battle was quick and horrible, but more so for the Seljuk Turks. Tutak deserted Kerboha, as did other Turkish leaders, and this reduced the great numerical advantage of the Turks. Soon, the defeated Muslim Turkish troops were in a panicked retreat. As Kerboha fled, the men in the citadel surrendered to Bohemond personally, rather than to Raymond. This seems to have been arranged beforehand without Raymond's knowledge. As expected, Bohemond claimed the city as his own. After a long 8 months, this city of Antioch was in Crusader control. After many battles and 3 years of traveling and fighting, the Crusaders had reached Jerusalem, and they were desperate to take control of it. At this point, the Crusader army had been reportedly reduced to around 12,000 to 15,000 men, but the remaining Crusaders were not weak. They were only stronger in their bloodlust to take and pillage the city. While traveling from Antioch to Jerusalem, the Crusaders encountered little resistance, as local rulers preferred to make peace with them and furnish them with supplies rather than fight. Raymond and the Crusaders initiated a siege of Arca on February 14 of the year 1099. But with different divisions of Crusaders and different leaders quarreling, the siege of Arca lasted until May 13, but ultimately failed. In the time of the Crusaders approaching Jerusalem, the Fatimids had recaptured Jerusalem from the Muslim Seljuk Turks the year before, and attempted to make a deal with the Crusaders, promising freedom of passage to any pilgrims to the Holy Land on the condition that the Crusaders not advance into their domains. But this was rejected by the Crusaders. The Fatimid Iftikhar al-Dawla was governor of Jerusalem and was well aware of the Crusaders' intentions, so he expelled all of Jerusalem's Christian inhabitants, and he also poisoned most of the wells in the area to slow the Crusaders down. On May 13, the Crusaders arrived at Tripoli, where the Emir Halal al-Mulk Abu Hassan provided the Crusader army with horses and vowed to convert to Christianity if the Crusaders defeated the Fatimids. The Crusaders reached Jerusalem, and the siege officially began on June 7 of the year 1099. The Crusaders divided their forces into two main groups. One group, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, attacked from the north, while another group, led by Raymond of Toulouse, attacked from the south. At first, the Crusaders struggled. Their early attack failed, and they lacked the proper equipment to break through the city's strong walls. They also faced shortages of food and water, along with the intense summer heat. However, the situation changed when supplies and skilled engineers from Guaglielmo and Briasso arrived by ship at the nearby port of Jaffa. These supplies included wood and materials that allowed the Crusaders to build siege equipment. The Crusaders constructed large siege towers, a battering ram, and other tools needed to attack the city. On July 13, the Crusaders began their main attack, and on July 15, forces led by Godfrey successfully broke through the northern walls of the city. Once inside, the Crusaders quickly gained control as the defenses collapsed. The fall of Jerusalem marked the successful end of the First Crusade. However, the aftermath was extremely violent. Many of the city's Muslims and Jewish inhabitants were killed. Eyewitness accounts from Crusaders confirmed there was a severe and horrible slaughter, but some historians propose that the scale has been exaggerated in later medieval sources. The majority of the Crusaders now considered their job complete, and many returned home. Many who had given up and returned home or never made it out of Europe were mocked and threatened with excommunication from the church. Those who had survived and returned were seen as heroes. On July 22 of the year, or July 22nd of the year 1099, a council was held that established the Kingdom of Jerusalem. No leader was asserted, and although Raymond of Toulouse was thought to be able to claim the throne, his hand in the loss of the siege of Arqua resulted in a decrease in his approval, so he declared that only God could be king, and refused the idea. Pope Urban II died on July 29th of the year 1099, just 14 days after the capture of Jerusalem, before the news had reached Rome, meaning that Pope Urban II died without knowing Jerusalem had been captured. The Kingdom of Jerusalem lasted until the year 1291, but the city of Jerusalem itself would be taken back by Muslims in the year 1187, which would last for 40 years until another crusade would be called. Crusader states were born in the areas which the Crusaders had conquered. and the Knights Templar was created in the year 1118 to defend Christian pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem. To summarize, the First Crusade was the first of many war expeditions where mainly Western Christians set out to reclaim Holy Land from Muslim control. The First Crusade was declared in the year 1095 by Pope Urban II and resulted in a Crusader victory, but came with the cost of thousands of lives and unspeakable acts done for the supposed holy cause. The First Crusade and the Crusades after would have long-lasting effects that changed nations, religion, and the state of history itself. Thank you all for watching.